So hello and welcome everyone. We're going to get started right away with our event tonight, which is Dialogue, Universal Basic Income, hosted by the Edmonton Public Library. My name is Emily. I'm a librarian here with EPL, and I have my colleague Nadia here as well. A few things to note before we jump right into the conversation. This event is being recorded. So we're asking our audience members to keep their cameras and their microphones turned off, but you can still get in touch with us through the chat function. And if you have any tech questions or questions about Zoom, please enter it in there and library staff can assist you. And you can also ask questions of our panelists through the chat function, but just note we won't get to audience questions until near the end of the event. So with that, I have the pleasure of introducing you to our host and moderator for this evening, Carissa Halton. Carissa is a nonfiction writer based in Edmonton. Her writing focuses on themes of inequality and social justice, a strong theme in her book of essays about finding rich community in Alberta Avenue despite its reputation. She has worked as an inner-city nonprofit director, communication specialist, advisor to the Premier, and government ministers on affordable housing. And now she is writing a novel. Thank you so much for joining us, Carissa.
Thanks for inviting me, Emily. So you're ready for us to take it away?
Ready for you to take it away.
All right. Well, thank you to our audience of Black Boxes. I see you all. I'm looking forward to seeing some of your faces as we get into our question and answer conversation at around 8:05 or so, once we've had our conversation with the panelists. So I just wanted to introduce you to our panel. Evelyn Forget is a leading authority on basic income in Canada. There you see her now. She began researching basic income by reanalyzing Canada's 1970s Mincome experiment. That's short for minimum income. Continues to work as an economist in the School of Medicine at the University of Manitoba. Now, Basic Income for Canadians is her book and was shortlisted for the Donner Prize for Excellence in Public Policy Writing, and her work has been featured widely in major media, including the Globe and Mail, PBS Marketplace, The Guardian, Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times. She lives in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Thank you for coming and joining us here in Edmonton, Evelyn.
Delighted to be here.
Rebecca Graff McRae is a research manager for the Parkland Institute at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. She completed her undergraduate and doctoral studies in Queen's University, Belfast, exploring the role of memory and commemoration in post-conflict transition. She has previously held a research assistantship with the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's, a postdoctoral research fellowship at Memorial University, Newfoundland, and at the University of Alberta. Thanks for joining us, Rebecca. Now, I will be throwing up these, the panel bios into the chat, just so people can go back and see as people are chatting. You'll be able to go again and look back because you're maybe not taking notes right now. Jenna Van Draenen is an assistant professor at the University of Washington. Right now you're sitting in Vancouver, is that right, Jenna? Right. And her research focuses on the role of poverty in shaping mental health and substance use outcomes. She has served on the board of directors for Basic Income Canada Network for nearly a decade, and she is also involved with several other basic income organizations, including Livable Income Vancouver and the Coalition Canada Basic Income. So thank you, Jenna, for being here too.
Pleasure.
Hannah Pazderka is a colleague with the Basic Income Canada Network. She's new to the board of directors there. She's an adjunct professor in psychiatry at the University of Alberta. She has focused on child and adolescent mental health for the last 11 years. She became sensitive to the need for a universal basic income after seeing what many of you will likely remember quite well in your mind is that widespread, the mental health after effects that came after job losses and the fire in Fort McMurray. Hannah is, of course, new to the board of directors with Basic Income Canada Network, and we'll talk a little bit more about that network's idea of universal basic income as we get into the conversation. So thank you all to all four of you. I'm so pleased to be chatting, and I know that there's lots of people on the list and in this Zoom here out there in the dark that are really interested in universal basic income. Many of you will know a lot about universal basic income, and some of you may know nothing at all. Maybe you just received CERB, or maybe you've heard something on the radio about people just getting cash all the for free. We need to talk, I think, right from the beginning. Let's just get our facts straight. And Evelyn, can you give us a little bit of just a basic introduction to universal basic income? What is the definition at its most basic level?
Sure. Basic income is a transfer of money from the government to residents of Canada, sufficient to live a modest but dignified life. It's independent of work status. So if you qualify on other grounds, you can receive a basic income whether you're working or not working. It comes in different flavors. In Canada, most of the conversation has been around a concept called basic income guarantee, or a guaranteed livable income. And that is an income tested benefit. So if you have no income from any other source, you receive the full benefit. If you have other income, your benefit would be reduced, but by some proportion of the money, your other income. So it acts as a top up for low-wage working people, and it replaces provincial income assistance.
Replaces provincial income assistance.
Right.
So then there would be some kind of level target amount that would be identified by.
That's right.
Like who in other jurisdictions
Somewhere
perhaps that
close.
use it, how do they determine where that line is?
Well, Basic Income Canada sees it as somewhere close to the poverty line.
Okay.
So.
Okay. So when we're talking about a basic amount, amount of money that's about aligned with the poverty line that would ensure that anybody, whether they're making money, it would be a top up, and if they're making nothing, then it would be the 100%, the full amount. Anybody else want to add to that definition? Sounds about right. Okay, we're all in agreement. Our facts, we've all agreed that this is the sort of the working definition. I'd love to hear how all of you were drawn to this policy idea of universal basic income. It's something that, you know, some people would say is like a completely crazy idea. It's so out there. Other people would say it's the only reasonable thing. And so I'm kind of curious about your stories of your path of getting to that place of being both curious for it and obviously advancing the policy idea. So maybe, do you want to start with Rebecca?
Thanks, Carissa. I guess my first real introduction to basic income was I had literally just returned to my role at Parkland Institute following maternity leave. It was my third child, not my first. And someone pitched us a project exploring UBI and different sort of different understandings of basic income, and really trying to dig through the question of whether it was possible for Alberta. And I think that was sort of the first time that I really thought beyond just the basics of basic income, I guess, and wanted to know more about the nuances and the complexities and the history of it. And there was a lot. And so I didn't really know where to begin. I think like most people, I started with Google, and Google pointed me to a vast body of work by one Evelyn Forget, which I think was probably the best possible place to start. So I think as I just started to read her study on the Manitoba Mincome experiment, and the thing that just absolutely grabbed me was her findings around what the Mincome payments were able to do for, especially for new mothers. And her finding that they were able to take more time at home than the very short maternity leave benefits that were offered at that time. And I think that just resonated with the place that I was at in my life.
Oh, thanks, Rebecca. Jenna, you want to what was your path?
Sure. Yeah, my basic income origin story was probably back in 2010, maybe a little bit earlier. At the time I was doing my master's, and throughout my master's and even my PhD, I became really concerned with the role of income in shaping our lives. And we know as health researchers that income is one of the strongest predictors of people's health. And so I started looking at public policy, and so much of our income is actually determined by public policy, especially people whose income might be at or below the poverty line. And so I was really concerned with effectiveness. And, you know, we're doing such a terrible job, in my opinion, of giving people dignified access to income security, especially at that lower end of the income spectrum, but you could argue in other places too. And so I just became, concerned with effectiveness, and similar to Rebecca, started exploring the scientific literature, came across some of Evelyn's work and some other scholars. And it was just, to me, I'm in the no-brainer camp, Carissa, you mentioned in the beginning. I see this as, you know, one of the strongest public policy decisions that could shape the health of all Canadians. And so to me, it's just a fundamental part of ensuring health and well-being. And so as I continued on with, you know, my research and scholarship, I committed to continuing on in income security advocacy in basic income and other areas, because I'm convinced that, you know, my academic work can make a difference, but only insofar as it contributes to shaping public policy, because I think that is really what is going to change people's lives. So thanks for asking.
Hannah, you worked with children for many years. Tell us a little bit about your path to UBI. You know, again, mental health and then economist stuff always, you know, people don't always see it as something that's very parallel.
No, I mean, for sure. And I think it's actually really important, because I do look at it from the mental health lens. And it was interesting when Evelyn was speaking about, you know, the fact that UBI can be income tested. It occurred to me that, you know, one of the things that we tend to think of UBI as being, or I think there's a public perception that it's like you're either a person who needs this or a person who doesn't. But, you know, as anyone who knows about mental health will tell you, 1 in 5 Canadians, 1 in 5 people worldwide will go through some sort of mental health crisis or experience mental health disorder in their lifetime. And so it's the kind of thing where you might be fine now, but you don't necessarily know where you'll be in 5 years. And you definitely know other people, you know, 1 in 5 of us, like I said, who is going to go through something. And a lot of those mental health issues can be super challenging in terms of being able to hold down a quote unquote regular job. And so that was, you know, primarily how I got here. But when you look at like the situation that's happened with COVID, I think all of us now understand that sometimes things happen that we haven't necessarily been able to prepare for in any meaningful way. And sometimes you need to have that stopgap to get us from here to there. So I hope that that's become clear to the Canadian public and Canadian politicians over the course of the last year.
Well, and we'll talk later about this idea of, you know, what's the difference between doing it just in the emergency and doing it, well, you know, the word universal suggests that this is something that is sort of a permanent, constant type of policy. So I'm really curious to hear more from you on that piece. Evelyn, your path, Mincome, I wasn't sure if I was even saying it right. So
Yep, that's right. I'm an economist and I work in a hospital. I'm a health economist. My office is in the major teaching hospital in Manitoba, and it serves a very low income population. And when you're an economist and you work in healthcare, people always ask you one question, and that is, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to make the healthcare system sustainable? And it doesn't take very long walking through the hallways of the hospital and chatting to patients and just looking at the kind of work we do to recognize that we're treating poverty in a very inefficient way through our healthcare system. People are in hospitals largely because they've spent many, many years living in inadequate housing, eating inadequate diets, struggling with the stresses of trying to live and trying to feed their kids on not enough money. And it just seemed to me that there must be a more efficient way of dealing with some of the trauma that people are dealing with than waiting for them to get sick and then trying to mop up the consequences of poverty through our healthcare system. And I remembered this old Mincome experiment. And so I went back and looked for the data. And that's really where I started more than a decade ago now. It must be 15 years ago.
I can't do Twitter and moderate at the same time, but if I was doing Twitter right now, like your quote about treating poverty in an inefficient way through our healthcare system, I've never thought of it quite like that. It's really powerful, Evelyn. Now, Jenna, you're a board director at Basic Income Canada Network. Maybe just give us a quick view of what that network is before I ask you the next question.
Sure. So the Basic Income Canada Network is a national network. We have members all across the country, and so we're a registered nonprofit, and we provide public education. We engage in dialogue like this. We also produce communications, and most recently produced a public policy options report that specifies 3 different options for how a basic income could actually be funded in the current income tax and transfer system. So we do all kinds of public education and activities like that. And yeah, it's a pleasure to be here today with you as part of BICN.
Well, if you have a chance at some point just to drop maybe the website for the network into the chat function, because then people can link up with that.
Yeah, and Facebook and all that good stuff too.
Yeah, no, please do. I'm curious though about, we've had welfare supports in this country since, I guess post the Second World War to some degree, and it's been building and shrinking and building different across all the provinces, I believe. It is a provincially administered system, the welfare system. And so I guess I'm curious about UBI and how, the network envisions it as being different from the welfare supports that we already have. So Hannah or Jenna, if you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, well, I'm really glad you asked, and Hannah, please jump in if you have anything else to add. But I think it's actually fundamentally different, and in the best possible way. So a basic income takes all of the intrusive rules and the moral policing that happens in our welfare system, and it eliminates that. So I personally have, so my research in substance use, I work with a lot of people who are experiencing low income in Vancouver's downtown east side. I see all kinds of policing and judgment and conditionality and unpredictability in our income support system. And honestly, I see it getting worse over time. In BC, our income assistance programs include multiple conditions. So you have to have a work search requirement, 2 years independence requirement, depletion of savings. That's all before you're even eligible. And then when you become eligible, you have to, meet with a caseworker regularly. You have to go through all kinds of, as I said, all kinds of rules and moral policing. And that is so fundamentally different from a basic income, which is a cash transfer that actually puts dignity and decision-making back into people's own hands. So you're allowed to use your own discretion to decide what you need to use that money towards. And as we saw in Evelyn's research, quite a few people end up choosing things like investing in their own education or, making choices for their lives that are much better in the long run and even better in the short run that the rules of the welfare system wouldn't allow them to do. So it actually gives people a floor to stand on and a lot of opportunity and investment in their own future. The other critical difference that I want to stress is that it's an amount that's typically much more livable than the welfare system. So if you compare the rates of social assistance right now to, for example, what we at the Basic Income Canada Network have modeled, or the CERB, much more livable rates of income through a basic income program, or the Ontario pilot, for example, a much more livable rate. So it's a floor for all of us to stand on rather than a social safety net to fall into.
So in this way, nobody, the idea, the policy idea is that nobody would be applying, wouldn't be applying for this in the sort of the way that they all already are, the forms, etc. Is the vision, I guess, Hannah, the vision would be that this would look a bit like CERB, where you just go in there and you click yes, no, yes, and then voila, 3 days later your money's there?
Well, I'm not sure exactly if they'd be, you know, how that implementation aspect of it would look, but I think Jenna's hit the nail on the head when she talks about, you know, really the cornerstone of the difference between this and the system that we have right now is that it's all about, fundamentally about dignity. It's all about giving people choices and allowing them to make decisions that are going to be right for themselves, rather than having them jump through hoops to prove that they need something. And we've seen that that can work, you know, through the entire COVID situation, where essentially people said, you know, the fundamental guideline was, we'll check later, you know, if we need to, but we need to make sure that everyone, you know, that we don't have people falling through the cracks. And that is a giant difference.
With your clients, how would you see something like what we're talking about here in this particular policy idea? How would it affect your clients?
Well, so for the most part, I actually work with children with mental health disorders, or for, the majority of them have experienced some sort of trauma. So in part of my work, I work with Little Warriors, who is an agency here in Edmonton, which deals with kids who have had sexual abuse. But I've also dealt with kids with other kinds of trauma, like, for example, the wildfires, things like that. And what they all have in common is that in order for trauma to get better, in order for things to resolve, you need to kind of go back to a life as usual kind of situation. And what we saw, especially in the Fort McMurray situation, was, you know, because they had the wildfires happen at first, and then they had all sorts of economic devastation follow, where people were losing their homes, were losing their jobs, and there was a lot of economic instability. And so what we saw is that the kids couldn't recover from the traumatization of the wildfires because there was no back to normal. And again, you know, that's what we're seeing with COVID as well. Who knows when things will get back to normal, or if there will be a normal to get back to that looks anything like what we're like. So the way that there's this interaction between economic instability and, you know, food scarcity and these kinds of fundamental concerns and our mental health, they can't be separated. They're, you know, the issues occur in lockstep. So the other important piece that I just want to mention when it comes to kids is, and like you said, that's my area, is that they don't have a lot of choice in terms of the economic circumstances in which they live. So if you have parents who lose a job or something like that, they might be thinking, oh, well, we'll just move to another province, or, you know, maybe I can switch what kind of work I'm doing, or, you know, they have choices, they have opportunities, they can make those decisions, but the kids are along for the ride. You know, the kids often don't have a say in it, and they may only find out later on, like, oh, I guess we're moving to a new city now, or you know, this is happening, which is a whole other layer of trauma on top of what they've already gone through. So having those kinds of supports in place and giving people the opportunity to make those decisions that are going to be right for them and better for their children, better for their families, it's crucial. It's crucial to having a healthy, functioning society.
So the families might not uproot, is the idea, at the time of, let's say, maybe the crisis that their child's going through it. If they had the option to have a universal basic income, they might make a different choice for their kid instead of having to put economic concerns in front of their kids.
That's exactly it. They might not feel forced to, you know, and that's the problem, is a lot of parents find themselves in a situation where they don't necessarily want to do something, but they feel that economically they don't have a choice. So this is about giving them those choices back, and that will ultimately be better for their kids.
Now, Evelyn, I mean, we've mentioned Mincome a number of times, and so maybe if you could just dive into your research a little bit in terms of the history of UBI in Canada. What did you discover with going back and doing that analysis?
Well, Mincome actually was conducted in the mid-1970s. A number of families in Manitoba received funding between 1975 and 1978. And the data was collected. The whole purpose of that experiment was to find out if families who received a basic income, whether they would work less. People were terribly worried about work disincentives. So this experiment was conducted because there had been a Senate report suggesting that Canada needed a basic income that was published 50 years ago now. So this experiment took place in the mid-70s, the data was collected, and if you remember, if you're old enough to remember the 1970s, or you're old enough to have taken a class that reminds you of what happened in the 1970s, it was a very unstable economic period. And what that means is that governments changed. It was funded partly by the federal government and partly by the provincial government. The provincial government changed midway through the experiment. And so it lost political support. The federal government was a minority liberal government, and it was sort of hanging on by its fingertips. And so basic income sort of fell off the priority list during the experiment. At the end of the experiment, the data was all collected, but there was no money left to do the analysis. And so the researchers were told to pack it away, and the analysis would be conducted later. When a couple of economists were able to go back and to look at the labor market data, they discovered that basic income didn't cause people to work less. Most people continued working as they had before. But there were two groups of people who worked less. The first were new mothers. In the 1970s, they were entitled to a 4-week maternity leave. And a lot of mothers thought that was a rather miserly maternity leave. And so they used the Mincome stipend to buy themselves longer parental leaves, which we've subsequently decided is a really good investment in society. So they, in fact, anticipated changes we later made. The other group of people who worked less, and the language turns out to be really important here, were young unattached males. And that turns out to be adolescent boys. So that's where the research stayed for a long time. And then about 15 years ago, I went looking for that data. And in particular, I went looking for those young unattached males because I wondered what they were doing. If they were working less, what were they doing instead? And the first thing I discovered was that the high school completion rates increased dramatically during that period. So in fact, these 15-year-olds, 15 to 19-year-olds were working less because instead of leaving school at age 16 and getting a full-time job, they stayed in school and they graduated from high school. So if you think about the life chances for those young men who got to graduate from high school in the mid-70s, it was tremendously affected by Mincome. The other thing I was interested in was quality of life and health outcomes. And I found that hospitalization rates really declined. And they declined primarily because of mental health issues for people who received a basic income. So that was the findings from Mincome. 40 years later, Ontario, of course, decided it was going to run its own basic income guarantee experiment. And some of you are familiar with the rather unhappy story associated with that experiment. 2017, this was put in place in a number of communities in Ontario. There was a provincial election and the new government decided to cancel the experiment really before it had begun. There was a survey done on people who participated in the experiment, and some of the findings from the Ontario experiment, they showed up in that survey, were very similar to the Mincome findings. In Dauphin in the 1970s, young men graduated from high school, boys in particular graduated from high school instead of leaving school early. In 2017, a number of people invested in community college. They paid their tuition and they intended to gain some job training. They reported improvements in mental and physical health. So the same kind of findings show up in every single experiment that takes place. Health improves, in particular mental health, especially in high-income countries. In low-income countries, it tends to be things like nutrition and child health that improves. People always invest in education in one form or another, depending on the cultural context that they happen to be in. People don't stop working. For the most part, adults continue working as they had before. You might see a little bit less child labor. So our experiments tell us the same thing over and over again. So that's sort of Canada's
So that's it. We've
Canada's
got
one of the-
one experiment that was done 40 years ago, and
That's
one
right.
experiment that started 3 years ago, and
That's
had
right.
what, 1 year of, was it 1 or 2 years?
Not
of
even that, because people were registered in the experiment on a rolling basis. So the last person was registered in the experiment in April, and I think the election took place in May, and the experiment was canceled in June. So some people had 7 or 8 months, and other people had less than that.
And how many people were part of the Manitoba experiment? Like off the top, you might not have it on the top of your head. But.
Yeah, I don't, but it's about 1,300 families in total.
Families, so that would have been the number.
It would have been families, so it'd be about 3 times than that. Yeah, people.
Okay. And so these adolescent boys too, just to clarify, they were receiving the basic income themselves individually because they were able to, but they were receiving it through their family.
They were receiving it through their families. When I went back, and I managed to talk to a number of people who participated in the experiment, and what they told me was what I expected, and that is that young boys in particular from low-income families had been under a fair amount of family pressure to become financially independent as quickly as they could. They tended to be large families, and if these boys could turn 16 and earn their own keep, so to speak, there'd be more family money for younger brothers and sisters. When Mincome came along, a lot of those families decided they could support their sons a little bit longer in high school, and many of them managed to graduate from high school.
Wow. So we don't have a ton of data, really. We've got the one more fulsome experiment, and then one that is much shorter. Hannah, I was just curious to come back to you around the Fort McMurray wildfire, and maybe some of the crisis, the way that the parallels that you saw with that crisis, and perhaps now what we're seeing here with COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that you're exactly right to draw attention to those parallels, because I don't think they're necessarily immediately obvious. But what makes those situations different than, say, the kind of sexual abuse or stuff that we see with little warriors is that those are examples of a mass trauma, an actual collective trauma event. And so in some ways they are much bigger and then different than what we normally see. But it has both kind of advantages and disadvantages, because like we've seen with COVID, theoretically, we're all in this together. And yet we've also seen that a lot of us are leading very different kinds of situations than one another. So one of the things that was very striking, though, in the Fort McMurray research was that there was a giant group of kids who were actually showing PTSD, symptoms of PTSD. So what we did was we gave questionnaires to the kids about 1.5 years after the Fort McMurray fire. And not just because it takes a little while for all of these processes to get put in place, but we gave them a raft of questionnaires basically looking at things like post-traumatic stress, depression, anxiety, as well as things like resilience, quality of life. So basically looking at how they're doing, how they're functioning. And what we found was, so you have to be wary when you hear about these kinds of studies, because it's not like a psychologist is sitting down with the kids and diagnosing them or anything like that, and they can get into a lot more detail. But what it did tend to suggest to us was that over 1/3 of the kids showed significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. So that's things like they could be experiencing nightmares or having flashbacks, or scared to think about the things that had happened in the wildfire, things like that, so really kind of scary symptoms. And this was, 1.5 years after the event had taken place. But what was more significant was we came back to them 1 year after that and 1 year after that. So the last time we went back was in November of last year, and did the same kinds of questionnaires with them. And what we found was the results weren't getting any better. So what we had seen originally was like 35-36% of the kids showed these significant symptoms of PTSD. By the time we did it last year, it was sitting stable at 37%.
And how much is this from the fire and the trauma of driving out of obviously we all saw those photos of the fire burning as they drove through it, and how much of it was the economic impacts and fallouts of the fire?
And this is exactly what we're trying to figure out right now. I have some some data that we're doing an investigation on to try and break into that, because our assumption as researchers was, well, of course they're going to get better. You're going to see the kids recovering over time. That only makes sense. But one of the explanations, one of the competing hypotheses that we've come up with is that it is the fact that economically they've been under continued stress this entire time. So I believe that there is a case to be made for the fact that the fact that so many of these families are losing their homes, are losing their jobs, it contributes to the fact that the kids can't recover from this from this stressful situation. So it's hard to disentangle all of it, but it seems clear that it's a huge factor.
Now, Rebecca, there was a little bit of emergency benefit, I remember at the time when the fire happened. It was just, again, really quick, they were sending out, wasn't a lot, but per person income, there was a little bit in that very immediate crisis time when people literally had no home. But Rebecca, you published a paper through Parkland in 2020, just this year. Amazing. It feels in January, pre-COVID though, right? And you were looking at sort of some of the possibilities and the pathways for UBI here in Alberta. And we'll get to that, the pathways for implementation in a little bit, but I'm curious about what you discovered around if there was any history of UBI in Alberta. So.
So I think taking the concept really broadly, because there wasn't anything implemented or sort of bandied about at that highest level called a basic income. But two examples that I think sort of show us two very, very different approaches to the concept of a sort of universal payment from the government. The first is in the 1930s, of course, during the height of the Great Depression. So the government at the time was under Premier Bill Aberhart, better known as Bible Bill, and his party was the social credit government. Now, social credit actually sort of evolved from this British sort of philosopher, theorist, C.W. Douglas, who had just these ideas about sort of how to engineer sort of social supports. And it got picked up in a lot of different places around the world and adapted in sort of unique and esoteric ways. So Aberhart's government was really committed to a lot of these principles and wanted to see how that might work in the sort of like economic crisis of the Great Depression. So what they proposed was a system of regular cash payments from the province to all Albertans. I've got this quote from James Mulvale, who's written quite a lot on the history of basic income, because the objectives of the Aberhart scheme were first and foremost as a means of enhancing consumer purchasing power. So what they wanted was to get money into the hands of your average consumer so they could buy. When they could buy things, they could kickstart the economy, that economic stimulus approach that we've seen in a different scale with, say, the 2008 recession as well, and also partly again during the COVID shutdowns and afterwards. So that was sort of their main objective, and the redistribution of wealth, what we think of as that sort of key poverty reduction motive, was much further down the list. They're seeing this as a way of stimulating business. So it definitely wasn't considered it was a novel idea, but they weren't a progressive or leftist government. Sorry, I'm losing my headphones. So that was the first thing. Now, this never really got off the ground, and partly because Alberta at the time, this might sound familiar, they didn't have any money in the bank. So asked their friendly neighborhood federal government if they might support the program, and the Fed said they could not because monetary policy was federal jurisdiction, not provincial. They felt that this overstepped those bounds about that separation of powers, and it just went nowhere.
And at that time, let's just clarify, there was no welfare programs that this provincial governments were running at the time, right? Middle of the
Not
Depression.
thinking strictly, no. There's sort of your typical 1930s, more of the nonprofit or religious-based charity approach. I'm trying to think too much on the history of it. The next step that Aberhart went to was to look into Alberta bonds and the establishment of the Alberta Treasury Branch as a public bank that might support loans to struggling Albertans who might not otherwise qualify. So he did try to look for these other avenues to sort of achieve the same ends after that was sort of kiboshed by Ottawa. So that's sort of like where Albertans can kind of go way back to. The other example, which I think might controversial, whether you want to include this, but I thought I'd throw it out there. When you talk about, you know, the first idea people have of a universal basic income, we're just writing a check to every person, just sending money to everybody, whether they need it or not. And if you're an Albertan of a certain age, you think Ralph Bucks. So 2006, this is the Alberta Prosperity Dividend, which due to massively rising oil and gas prices and the royalties that our province got off of them, the budget surplus was way higher than forecast. What do you do when you have way more money than you can shake a stick at? You say, well, let's ask the public what to do with it. Should we send everybody a check? So this was Klein's brilliant idea, partly at a time when his popularity was declining, no pun intended. And so what they did, they literally sent a check for $400 to nearly 3 million Albertans. And that also included several Albertan teenagers and people under the age of 18 who were sort of like, got these checks and immediately thought they were going to go on like a shopping spree or buy an iPod or buy new clothes or whatever. So it was really, I thought, really fascinating to me that there's some speculation that Klein wanted to make this a recurring payment along the lines of the Alaska Permanent Fund, if anyone's sort of familiar with that, that there would be an annual resource dividend that would be dished out to Albertans. Of course, at the end of 2006, Klein resigned as premier. And after that, we see the sort of first rumblings of the 2008 recession. And that extra money did not ever reappear. So I just thought that was two very, very different approaches to the idea of sort of universal cash payments.
Well, and if we get there, we may talk a little bit of politics, but interesting that both of those parties were both quite right of center, for sure. The, you know, Jenna, we've talked about what UBI is. Why of all times, I mean, this is a crazy time that we're all talking on Zoom, we're not actually in real life, you know, which we should, you know, one would say we should be if it wasn't COVID. Just tell me about what UBI might offer for our times at this time now, 2020, 2021.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think the pandemic has demonstrated how unpredictable our world is and how our income support systems are actually very vulnerable and our employment systems are pretty vulnerable. Even before the pandemic, we saw a lot of volatility in the labor market. Our labor markets are changing. There's, you know, quite a bit of technological unemployment that is forecasted on the horizon. And even if not that, we see increasing precarity, right? More contract and gig workers. So we have a world that I think is increasingly precarious and leaves individuals, all of us, vulnerable. And we have to look no farther than the global pandemic that's forced us to do this very panel virtually to see that we're all just one disaster away from losing our stable paychecks. And we need not be one disaster away from losing our well-being and our health, and we could have a system that is there for us when we need it. And we saw the emergency response, the CERB, that was implemented relatively quickly, and thank goodness it was, but it still left a lot of people out. And so we are talking about a basic income that would be there for everyone. And you mentioned earlier, Chris, as something you wouldn't have to apply for. That's absolutely it. Something that is there when you need it, and that responds to some of the inequities and some of the inefficiencies in our system too. And the last reason I want to give is that, and it echoes what Evelyn was saying earlier about we're paying for poverty in our other systems, in our healthcare system, in our criminal justice system, in other social systems that we have. Rebecca has a beautiful little bridge behind her, and in my field, in public health, we always talk about upstream, and there's a story about people falling through cracks in a bridge. And currently our medical system saves people from drowning. But what we're proposing here really is fixing the bridge. So we're proposing to prevent people from falling in a river and drowning to begin with. And it turns out that that's not only a dignified and very humane and wonderful thing to do that makes our society better and friendlier and more caring, but it also saves money. It's just a better system. It's, the old adage of, you can prevent something and save all this and save all this money downstream. So yeah, so an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I mean, I'm going to throw you guys a little bit because I'm going to ask a question out of order of what we had originally discussed. But I come from a social, from the nonprofit world, and there's lots of talk about ROI, right? Return on investment. And, if we weren't paying for these mental health supports, in the hospital setting, we were paying at home, we save this much money. But I've also worked inside government, and I know that it's pretty hard though to displace the spending that you're already spending in the healthcare system. So for a time, I'm not sure how many years, you end up spending on the healthcare system to be there, as well as on these new supports, because you're not immediately getting those savings from, Gerald didn't go to the hospital 280 times into the ER this year. So we saved. Well, we didn't save. The ER continued to be there. The nurses continued to be there. And so Evelyn, I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about this piece of it, this idea of, it gets to the point of how do we pay for it, but also this idea of that I've sort of introduced around ROI. And
yeah, I mean, I think what we're looking at is bending the curve. If you think about hospitalization, even during the 3 years of the experiment, the Mincome experiment, hospitalization fell by 8.5%. And if you realize that Canada is currently spending more than $70 billion a year on hospitals, there's a lot of money there. But you're quite right. I mean, you don't close down one system because you've got another one that you think is going to save you money ultimately. So what you're really doing is trying to bend that curve. We know that healthcare costs are increasing, and instead of them increasing that way, you want to slow down the increase in costs associated with healthcare. But,
so
I mean, I think it's
are for the future.
The savings are for the future, and I think that part of what we have to do is to change the short-run mindset that's caused so much difficulty with our social programs. I mean, I think we've underinvested in the public sector. We've underinvested in social programs for 3 decades, since the mid-1990s, and probably earlier than that if I thought about it. So we've underinvested, and we've left ourselves in a very vulnerable situation. And CERB is a really good example. You've got the shock that happens, and suddenly you've got a very vulnerable economy, because half of Canadian families are living paycheck to paycheck. A third of the workforce is in precarious labor. And if the government doesn't do something, you can take the shock and you can make things much, much worse, because it'll simply spin, and it will worsen the situation. So, I mean, I think part of what we have to do is to change our mindset from this short run, money saving, cost cutting perspective, and recognizing that basic income is really an investment. It's an investment for the future. Ultimately, there will be a return, but you can't expect that money to come immediately. So the question is, where do you get the money from in the short run? And I think there are lots of ways we can do that.
Okay, tell us about that. I mean, that's the like hating question. I think you introduced it at the very beginning. You know, well, how the hell do we pay for this? This sounds really expensive, right? So take us away, Evelyn.
All right. Well, no less an authority than the Parliamentary Budget Office, right? This arm's length organization that holds governments to account actually asked what a basic income would cost in Canada. And you need something concrete to cost, and Basic Income Canada has costed a number of different and more generous programs. So I'll let Jenna and Hannah talk about that. But they said, okay, well, suppose we take what Ontario was going to offer in their basic income experiment. So a single adult would receive about $17,000 a year. A two-adult family would receive about $26,000 a year. That would be the guarantee. Any child benefits would be in addition to that for the children. And they costed this first 2 years ago and said, okay, during normal economic times, this will cost about $43 billion a year. But they didn't reduce the cost for the fact that it was replacing provincial income assistance. Provinces were already spending $20 billion a year. So the net cost of that would be $23 billion a year in ordinary economic times. And just to put that in perspective, that's almost exactly what we pay every year for the Canada Child Benefit. It's less than half of what we pay for seniors' pensions every year. So it becomes an expensive program, but not an outrageously expensive program. It's something we can afford if we choose to afford it. It would approximately double what we're currently spending on provincial income assistance. They redid that little estimate of costs this year during the pandemic and came up with much higher costs, as you might expect. When everybody's out of work, everybody's working reduced hours, incomes have declined, the costs were much higher. But the interesting takeaway from this year's estimate is that a basic income would still cost less than the CERB and the other supports that the federal government put in place. So it's still a much more efficient way of dealing. I mean, one of the real benefits, I think, of a basic income is that it's an automatic stabilizer. When the economy goes into difficult periods, when it goes through something like COVID or something like the 2008 financial crunch, basic income automatically expands to meet the needs of families. When the economy recovers, it automatically contracts. And that's a strength, not a weakness. The fact that it costs more during bad economic times, it costs more because it's putting money into the hands of people who need it. So it's not an impossibility. We can afford this. This is well within the capacity of the country to pay for. If you have a more generous scheme, obviously it's going to cost more money. And there are lots of different schemes out there that people have estimated the costs of.
Thanks, Evelyn. Hannah, do you want to jump on there, like in terms of the network and some of your findings?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the most important takeaway from all of this is that the money is there and it's kind of hidden away in all sorts of nooks and crannies. And it's a matter of purposing those resources in a different way than we've been doing. So for example, things like the GST and the PST, and those are things that we all pay into every day. If you took some of that money and directed it towards a basic income, that would be very doable. And I'm old enough to remember when the GST was first instituted and people were completely up in arms. But of course now it's like we don't even really think about that. So for sure we could do something like that. Things like old age pension payments, things like that. We would use some of these other resources in order to help fund this specifically. So it's just a matter of changing the way that we see these things and the way that we access them. I'm not an economist by any stretch, but I think that what Evelyn's saying is exactly on the money. It's not as though we necessarily need a whole bunch of new funds. It's a matter of thinking more creatively about this and making different choices. I'll let Jenna expand on that as well.
Well, I was just going to pop a link into the chat, which is a policy options report that might be way too detailed or just right for some people. So don't be intimidated, but perhaps it would help those of you who are really curious about how you might pay for it. BICN has costed how to fund a $22,000 basic income annually for adults without substantial increases in personal tax. I've been seeing some of the chat history. So, and it does involve rolling in, for example, the provincial income assistance programs, which would be redundant because people would be getting, in fact, a more generous transfer, slightly more generous transfer. So you wouldn't need to have welfare anymore. And some things like GST credits, some very, very marginal income tax increases for very highest income brackets, but not really overall, and some small changes to other taxation, other elements of taxation. But it's really, I think it's remarkably palatable, is what I would say. In terms of how you would fund it, and there are other creative ways as well. There's a variety of models out there, but we've actually done the work to show 3 different models that could be funded in the existing income tax and transfer system without incurring extra debt, which I think was a question that was raised in the chat. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll put the link.
Thank you, Jenna. I'll let people go to the link, but I want to go to Rebecca about some of your work. I mean, if you have more to say on top of Jenna's piece, go ahead now.
Sorry, just the quick thing, because I think there was one question about how to avoid incurring some of the very high deficit numbers that we've just seen out of CERB. I think that the very important point to remember is that CERB was sort of like fly by the seat of your pants, very ad hoc and very, very improvised response to the pandemic in order to be as quick as possible to get funds to Canadians. So some of the offsets that Jenna and Hannah and Evelyn have talked about, the idea of like finding change in the couch cushions or redistributing budgetary
holding there.
Oh, sorry.
We'll let her unfreeze, maybe.
Sorry. Are you back?
Am I frozen, or was that Rebecca frozen?
You were frozen for a minute.
Sorry, guys. I'm jumping in. I'm just going to turn my video off just so that I don't freeze again. Rebecca, I wanted to go to you, and I'm sorry if I missed it. You actually answered this while I was frozen. I'm curious to know from your research just how you saw UBI being most effectively and realistically implemented. Like, what jurisdiction is rolling this out? How does it, because of course currently we've already talked about CERB, which is a federally rolled out policy item, and then you've got our program, and then you've got of course welfare being provincially run. So, and there's other little programs that the cities run as well. Let's not forget that the municipalities do a lot of work around homelessness reduction and policing, etc. So there's lots of spending happening municipally as well. So just walk us through how you imagine the jurisdictions working together on this, or just maybe it's a single one.
I think where the major efficiency for a basic income comes in is reducing all of those multiple layers of sometimes redundancy or competing jurisdictions, programs that sort of replicate what other ones are doing. So I think it makes the most sense to me from that perspective to have something that's consistent across the provinces and territories, that's federally directed, but that might have some flexibility, to take into account the different needs of different provinces. Particularly if you look at the territories face much different costs and different challenges in that way around like food costs and housing costs and stuff especially. So I think that's what makes the most sense to me from a non-economist perspective. But I'm a political scientist. So from a political perspective, I worry about the potential for sort of very tense political federal conflicts around a program like that. Like say it happened in Eberhardt's time, and it's been very apparent during this pandemic that some provinces resent the idea of having programs imposed by Ottawa. There's the constant bane of my existence, which is people's frustration with the equalization program. These sorts of things they don't really have to have anything to do with a basic income program, but there are issues that can be conflated in the political discourse, which could make the idea of a sort of like top-down national program very politically fraught.
Oh, thank you. Evelyn, I want to hear from you. Where have you come? Where do you land on this one? Federal, provincial?
Federal, provincial.
Oh.
Well, I'm an economist, not a political scientist. And, you know, Canada does have a history. We do have the capacity to allow provinces to opt out of federal programs. If you think of the Canada Pension Plan, for example, Quebec runs its own Quebec Pension Plan, so long as they meet federal guidelines. And from an economic point of view, most of the provinces are in very, very tight straits. Most of the provinces owe a lot of money. They are in very difficult fiscal position. And I think that while there might be some resentment of the federal government intruding into provincial jurisdiction, there's also the recognition that if a federal basic income were to come along, it would free up an awful lot of provincial money that could be spent on other things. It could be spent on long-term care, it could be spent on childcare, it could be spent in the education system, it could even be spent on reducing the debt and the deficit. And the federal government has a much greater fiscal capacity than the provinces do. I do think it's important to allow provinces to shape the program differently to meet particular needs, but I think that can be done within the context of federal guidelines.
Jenna, do you have anything to add on from either yourself or the Basic Income Canada Network sort of position on how a UBI would be best implemented? What's the path for implementing that and federally?
Yeah, well, I think enough has been said about the federal provincial jurisdiction, complications, but I see the most potential for this program nationally. I do advocacy work municipally and provincially and nationally, and I think a program like this really should be national to work best. Because of all of the things we've been talking about, the universality that people need. And if you look at our universal healthcare system, part of what makes it work is the principles that it's founded in, and having that consistency across the country. In terms of, and I wanted to shift a little bit to the implementation side, I just wanted to give people a little bit of encouragement, because I think we're actually not that far away from something like this as people might think. So if you look at, for example, the Canada Child Benefit, that's a basic income. People sometimes don't like to talk about it, but essentially that's an unconditional cash transfer that goes to people who need it, who have young kids. And we have a lot of evidence that it's actually improved health and social outcomes for those families. We have a lot of evidence that they don't, spend it in ways that we might judge or think are bad. We have evidence that it increases food security and, school outcomes and mental health outcomes for those kids. So, and we also have another basic income, and it's in the form of seniors benefits. So really the only group that's currently unprotected is this sort of the 18 to 64-year-olds. And we know that those programs work and are beneficial. And so really what we're talking about is a shifting of our income security system to a way that we know works better. And we are seeing a lot of support for it. Very last thing I want to say is that the Coalition Canada, another group that I work with, cross-country advocates, have met with over 70 MPs and senators across the country just to have conversations about basic income, find out what their constituents think. And we are hearing that across party lines, people are really interested in this. So there's a lot of public support. I mean, I was, I'm hearing basic income in conversations at the grocery store and things like that. That was not the case 10 years ago. So, we still have a ways to go on the implementation front, but we are closer than we ever have been. So I'll leave.
Thank you, Jenna. That gives us a good visual of just really where those basic incomes already exist in Canada, and maybe where there's some gaps. Hannah, did you have any other thoughts before? I want to go to the questions in the chat, but any other points you want to make about implementation and sort of the possibility that this could hold for Canada?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the one thing, again, from like a mental health perspective that I think we need to keep in mind is that what's undermining a lot of this is some sort of us versus them mentality. And I think, you know, anyone who's been on social media for 15 minutes in the last decade has seen that kind of thinking. But this idea that, you know, people won't have incentives to work, people are greedy, people are going to take advantage, some kind of thinking like this. And it's really that I see as being like the core holdup. It's not really a question of, you know, can we find a way to afford it, or, you know, whose jurisdiction does it fall under? You know, those are important questions, but those are questions we can tackle. I think at the heart of it, what we need to do is to accept the fact that people have a basic right to life and dignity and making those kinds of decisions for themselves, and that basic income gives us the opportunity to do that in a way that we haven't been able to do so far. So that's the last piece I'll throw in there.
Well, thanks so much to our panel. I'm going to we'll come back at about 8:20 to give you sort of a final few sentences, or maybe if you want to make a pitch, then I'll let you do that. Then I'm just going to go to the questions here. I'm just going back in the chat a little bit. You'll see that for those of you who jumped on here a little after our introductions, I have put in the chat the bios for all of our wonderful panelists here. I have a comment here from Ryan. He says he hadn't explored UBI before, and it's his first exposure to the idea. Question is, would UBI also replace the student loan program? Evelyn, in your imagination, I guess, you know, again, UBI isn't fully formed yet, but.
Well, I think that when you talk about what exactly is inside the program and what's outside the program, that's a matter of implementation and program design. I guess my own sense is that the student loan program serves slightly different purposes, and so it might be reasonable to keep it outside, but it's not, to be honest, something that I've thought in great detail about.
It's an interesting point about program design, because in some ways I didn't ask the political question, right, around how do the political in the political spaces where you see so much polarization and rhetoric, you know, that how do they come together? But maybe that's where they come together, where actually the devil is in those details of
absolutely
how high the basic income actually is, how, you know, all of the range of questions that I'm sure there's about, I don't know, how big a regulation book do you think UBI would be if it actually came into
smaller than provincial income assistance, I guarantee.
Would it? Okay. The next question we have here is a question. I heard of an unconditional lifelong salary from someone named Freet. Apparently it is different from universal basic income, but they don't understand the difference. Do any of you know an unconditional lifelong salary? If this is, you heard of such a thing? Any model? Is this maybe a model from a different nation? And in this case, we're talking about UBI. It wouldn't go, it's like the child benefit. Again, this is the details, but the imagination would be that it would be somewhat, that not every single human in Canada would get the check, that it would be somewhat income tested. Is that correct? Okay, so it's not like Ralph Bucks going to everyone. There would be a bit of a range. Okay, and then the concern about debt. Ryan, do you feel like your question was answered? Maybe just drop in the chat and let me know if you felt like that question around whether CERB and the debt that it's incurred, whether we can pull this off without boring, if they've answered that question for you. Now, why is this such a hard political sell? That's a great question. That's a question I kind of wanted to ask earlier. So maybe Rebecca, you know, political science this thing up. Do you want to start?
To be honest, no, I think there's two sort of two different environments here. We're talking on paper and we're talking in practice. When I was doing my review of the literature, the very, very extensive history of people bandying about the idea of a basic income, and like this goes back to like Thomas Paine, and what we find in theory is just the opposite. It's not a difficult political sell. There's people from every different point on the political spectrum, or like the political matrix, if you want to put it that way, who have espoused the idea. But as you alluded to earlier, the devil's in the detail. So one thing that myself and my co-author found was that people from different ends of the political spectrum tend to be talking about very different ideas of what a basic income should look like. And in many cases, people who are right of center fiscally envision that this would be an opportunity to completely replace so many aspects of the social welfare system, and also in many cases, public services. So if we're sending you a check from the government every month, then perhaps you don't need free K-12 education and it should all be private pay. Perhaps we don't need universal free healthcare because the government's already giving you money. So in some cases, that fiscally conservative mindset to a basic income is that it completely negates the idea of needing the government to pay for social services and other types of social support. On the other hand, from a left of center perspective, they're seeing this as a floor in addition to, right, universally accessible public services based on need, based on equity, and a way of leveling out that very those inequalities, social and economic inequalities. So I think the big question is, what really are you selling? What's your objective? What's your end game? And what do you want a basic income to achieve? Is it about poverty reduction? Is it about reducing income inequality? Is it about those social determinants of health and those downstream impacts? Or is it about reducing down the size of the welfare state and small government and hands off?
I have a question. Did anyone else want to jump in on that one? It's an interesting one. Jen,
I'll
I
just
see you on
say that I agree with what Rebecca is saying, because I think sometimes the political support, although it is widespread across the political spectrum, people can be supportive of different things or different models. And so I think it really is important to talk about specifics. And I will say that the Basic Income Canada Network is absolutely firm that we support a basic income in addition to the social services that we rely on in our society right now, like healthcare, and we have a public transportation system, things like that. So I think it really does matter what you're talking about, but I also really wanted to sort of drop again into the room the idea of technological unemployment. And I think that's a bit of a game changer. And I am seeing a lot more support from the tech sector and from people who are right of center, but not too far right of center, just perhaps because of the work that they do are in the technology field, who are realizing actually that, the labor market is changing very profoundly. And that we need to respond to it. So I think there is more. I think there is more sort of potential for coalescence around a model that could work. And I also think we're living in a society that has a lot of social programs that we have agreed on both the left and the right. So we have lots of universal programs that we've come to agreement on. So I don't think it's impossible, but I do agree that it matters what we're talking about.
You mentioned AI, and there's a question here. The comment is, there hasn't been any discussion on automation and AI tonight and the impact of these on the job market, although, another critical question around UBI. So do any of the panelists have thoughts on that? I see you nodding, Evelyn. Do you have?
Well, I agree with Jenna. I think this is vital. I mean, from my perspective, the most significant impact of technological change is a change in the nature of employment, not the amount of employment, not the number of jobs, but the kind of jobs that are created. And if you think about some of the online platforms that allow people to outsource labor, for example, outsource parts of jobs all over the world, things like Upwork, for example, where you can take a project, if you're an employer, you can take a project and break it down into a number of parts and hire people from anywhere in the world to do this project on a short-term basis with no benefits, with no security at all. I think we're seeing more and more of that. And I think that that's something that is absolutely changing the nature of the labor market, of what we can expect from our employers, and also changing the nature of what it is that we have to rely on the government to provide.
So the idea here is that the work is more precarious?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So yeah, standard jobs are becoming more and more scarce over time. And it's happening not only in manufacturing jobs where we might be able to imagine it, but also in jobs like journalism, for example, or in education, where somebody like me, a professor, retires and is replaced by a number of graduate students hired on a per course basis for much less money, with no stability and with no benefits. Journalists who might have been columnists in the past are instead turned into freelancers and don't have that kind of security to rely on. And we see it in medicine, for example, in pharmacy, where great parts of the job, pharmacy is a really good example, where pharmacists are being replaced not only by pharmacy technicians, but by robots that count the pills. And, you know, these kinds of changes are becoming a fundamental part of the labor market, and they're growing rapidly over time.
There's a question here around like timeline around implementation. You know, we saw CERB basically, you know, launch from, I don't know what, like 20 days, 15, 10, 12, you know, someone in the chat can correct me, but it was very, very quick after everything was shut down that suddenly there was checks moving, you know, and God bless all of those federal staff, people that were working night and day on that, because no doubt that was no easy feat. But looking at a program that was more universal, that let's say was federally, let's run with the idea that was federally at least funded, let's say, in terms of even like similarly to much of our healthcare. Perhaps it's transfers to the provinces, but it's funded by the feds. What would you say how long would it take to be implemented if we got a government that said, okay, we did universal childcare and now we're going to do universal basic income? Any guesses? Or maybe studies that you've done or research that where you've nailed it? Is this a 1-year rollout? Is this a 5-year rollout?
No, my first thought was, how long did it take to get marijuana into the stores? I mean, really, I mean, wasn't it like a year and a half? 2 years? I don't remember, but it was astronomically fast. We can do these things within the lifespan of a government. I think the danger is always what happens when the government changes and the next one doesn't necessarily agree. But I think we have a lot of hope from what we've seen with universal health care. There was a lot of resistance when that was first brought in, and now we take it for granted that that's a great idea, and everywhere except for Alberta, perhaps. I think that you know, most Canadians will agree that that's something that we could not live without, honestly. So hopefully, you know, something like this could be done efficiently, quickly, and it could be something that everyone comes to appreciate.
Evelyn, was that your hand waving?
No, just adjusting my glasses. I think it'll be interesting to watch as the government tries to retire some of these emergency benefits, to see what happens. We know that employment insurance wasn't working when COVID struck. We know that these emergency benefits had to be put in place in order to plug the gaps in the system. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of pressure emerges at that time.
Well, there was much written about, rewritten about the income, tax coming in during an emergency. World War II happened. They needed to charge, income tax just for this time, temporarily. Yeah. And now, of course, going on many, many years here now. And so do you see perhaps that those programs remaining similar to income tax, where you're going to see these things actually maybe not going away?
I don't think they'll stay in their current form, but I think there will be a lot of public support for the implementation of some variation of those programs.
How soon do you think there will be, maybe you're already in the data, Evelyn, but I'm curious to know, I mean, as a researcher who, you combed Mincome, and now to think of all of that data set that CERB has created, like are you salivating, and when will you be able to get into that data and really start to analyze it?
I'm sure there'll be all kinds of data available. I'm a little worried about generalizing too much from what we saw during the CERB, because I think it's hard to separate out the effects of the CERB from the effects of the pandemic, and from all of the craziness that's been happening this year. And I think sometimes people look at things that have happened and assume that it's because people have received this money, when it might have entirely different genesis. Yeah. So I think it's going to be a challenge to figure out what the consequences are.
We've got one more question here, and then maybe I'll go to each of you for your final comments. Once implemented, there should be decreased administrative and policing costs. What about universal basic benefits? To me, they should go hand in hand with UBI. UBI with no policing allows recipients to work to get ahead. I'm not totally sure I understand that question. Do you need clarification? What's the difference between universal basic benefits and UBI? Is that this conversation about the social safety net remaining, with there being an additional? Maybe Bernie, if you wanted to clarify that question. Emily's just dropped a couple of links, of course, to the EPL. Go support our local library. Evelyn's books are there. In fact, if you want to request them to order more, you can do that. It's a very nifty feature. Ryan asked, this will be the final question. Isn't the trajectory of costs for our healthcare unsustainable already? We had to borrow to pay for CERB. The tax revenue from thousands of small businesses that are failing and lost jobs would make paying for UBI plus getting out of debt difficult. Is there a solution to this? Okay, Rebecca's got her hand up.
Okay, can I just say that the word unsustainable is a really not politically neutral term. And it's meant to be very emotive and charged. Not picking on Ryan, but I've seen a lot of his comments come up. He's very, very, very concerned about debt and deficit and how unsustainable it all is. I get it. Those are very emotive topics, but that's precisely how that political discourse works, right? One thing is that all of these brilliant ladies to the right of my screen have outlined ways in which this could be, okay, if not cost neutral, but certainly not a prohibitive cost, and about redistributing how we budget money. It doesn't have to involve a huge addition to our debt load. Secondly, the part is that in terms of our healthcare system, as Evelyn and Jenna and Hannah all pointed out, when you address the social determinants of health, which means poverty, which means dealing with mental illness, which means people with other forms of structural inequalities, right? When you level the playing field for people, there are further benefits towards their mental health, their physical health, their overall lifetime well-being. And that's what makes your health system sustainable, right? Because you're reducing the load that you're putting onto it over generations. And that's not my opinion. That's backed up by the work from all of these ladies and many other people on it.
You're muted.
I have to do that one time every Zoom meeting is, leave myself on mute. Thank you, Rebecca, for that really clear answer. Maybe we'll start with, let's start with Hannah. I'll give you guys just we're at 8:25, so we've got 1 minute for each of you just to give us a final remark or comment or thought. Hannah, you go ahead and start.
I was just going to say, I loved Rebecca's last comment. That's exactly it. And it's always hard sell to talk about some of these making changes to things early on and the kind of changing the trajectory in terms of the kind of savings that brings you. It's really hard to say, like, well, if we make these changes, you'll see X many fewer people becoming addicted or in poverty, or things that have large, very, very expensive consequences down the line, because people don't see saving money. The governments find it hard to sell, a cost savings. And yet that is exactly how this gets paid for, because, 20, 50, 100 years from now, you look at it and you go, it's probably the best investment we ever made.
Thank you, Hannah. Jenna.
Well, my co-panelists have just done such a fantastic job. It's hard to top it. But I completely agree with the last two comments. I think we're really looking at an investment, and one that pays a lot of dividends. And one thing that I will perhaps stress is that this is for all of us. It's not just for poor people. It's not just for some people. It's for all of us. We're talking about building a system that can support everyone, so that if something happens with your son or your cousin or yourself, this is there for everyone. And I think there is quite a bit of dialogue actually on from groups that are looking at downstream cost savings and ways that this could actually stimulate the economy. We have groups that have emerged, CEOs for basic income. There's a group called UBI Works. They do quite a bit of work on that kind of cost saving thing. So I think it's an issue that we have seen a lot of rallying around lately, and I think that's for a good reason, because we're building something better for all of us, and it is very feasible, and much more so than the media might have had you believe before. So,
thank you, Jenna. Evelyn.
I think there's been a lot of chat in the context of COVID about the need to build resilience, personal resilience and social resilience. And I think that we should be thinking about basic income as introducing that kind of resilience into our society. So the next time a pandemic comes along, the next time a financial crisis comes along, the next time we're dealing with something like climate change or the consequences of climate change, we have in place these systems that can automatically respond to the shock and ensure that the economy and society can continue, so that we don't have to keep civil servants up 24 hours a day trying to put in place emergency programs that, as well as they worked, demonstrated their flaws as well, their limitations as well, because they were put in place so quickly.
Thank you, Evelyn. And Rebecca?
I'm going to maybe just throw in one more sort of something to think about for Albertans in particular. And I know this year we've had our attentions really, really focused on just surviving the pandemic. And at the moment, it looks pretty overwhelming with the situation we're in. But after the pandemic, there are going to be other crises. And as Evelyn points out, we're talking about climate change. We're also, like say, looking at automation in so many industries. And a big one is going to be in the oil and gas sector, where automation is already a huge factor in job losses and job reductions. I'm sure Hannah can talk about, like the Fort McMurray context. If we had the time, all I want to say is keep in mind that when the time comes that Alberta needs to transition away from a fossil fuel-based economy, a basic income could be a really crucial element of that just transition to support workers in that industry, to retrain and to keep their families afloat and our economy afloat while we do it.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Jenna. Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you, Hannah. I mean, not just for tonight, but for the research you've done in the past on this, and the continued work and the continued advocacy that you're going to continue to do around education, and what this could mean for our country and for our provinces and for our cities. Thank you to Emily, who she's just popped on in her video there. EPL extraordinaire and Nadia, both are on a committee that has started, launched a new group, a new dialogue series. I don't know if Emily's going to talk about that, but I'll let you talk about that. But thank you, Emily, for bringing all of these great people together, and thank you all for joining us for this really important hour and a half talking about a difficult and contentious policy and idea.
I just wanted to hop on at the end just to say thank you so much to our incredible panelists. I learned so much, and one of the most amazing things I think is I'm so inspired to learn more about this. And thank you so much to Carissa. You've been such an excellent host, and it is such an important conversation that I'm so happy that we were able to have. You can find lots more of our online events through the library's website, which is just epl.ca. And we hope to see you again. Thank you, all of you, for attending, for the great questions and comments that we've had in the chat. So thank you all very much, and have a wonderful rest of your night. Bye, everyone.